You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Garrett Lindsay. I'm 42 years old, and I used to live in Boise, Idaho before I sold everything to hit the road full-time. My girlfriend Marisol, she's 38, joined me about 8 months into the trip. We've been dating long distance for years, and when I told her I was buying a converted Sprinter van and leaving corporate life behind, she didn't hesitate. 2 weeks later, she quit her nursing job, and we were heading south together. We've been doing the van thing for about a year when this happened. You get comfortable, you know? You start thinking you've seen it all. Weird truck stops, sketchy rest areas, those nights when someone knocks on your van at 3 a.m. But nothing prepared us for what we encountered outside Tonopah, Nevada. It was late October, and we were making our way from Reno down to Arizona. Marisol had this thing about taking the loneliest roads possible. She said the solitude helped her decompress from all those years of hospital chaos. I usually went along with it because, honestly, the desert has this beauty that gets under your skin. But Highway 95 through Central Nevada, that's a special kind of desolate. We passed through Tonopah around sunset, grabbed some supplies at a gas station, and the guy behind the counter, this old-timer with a face like worn leather, he looked at our van and shook his head. "You folks planning to camp out tonight?" he asked. When I said, yeah, probably somewhere quiet off the highway, he got this look. "Stay on pavement," he said. "Don't go wandering the old mining roads. Not this time of year." Marisol laughed it off as local superstition, and honestly, so did I. About 20 miles south of town, we found this turnoff. Just a dirt road heading west into the desert, and you could see the remains of some old mining operation in the distance. Tailings piles and collapsed wooden structures silhouetted against the dying light. It looked perfect, the kind of spot where you wouldn't see another soul. We bumped along that road for maybe 2 miles until we found a flat area near an abandoned shaft house. The sun was already gone, just this purple-orange glow on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping fast. We set up like we always did. Marisol started dinner on our little propane stove while I checked our water situation and got the heater ready. The wind was picking up, making this low whistle through the old mining structures. That should have been our first real warning. But we camped in weird places before, and I figured it was just the desert doing its thing. Marisol made pasta. We ate watching some downloaded Netflix show on our laptop, and everything felt normal. Comfortable even. We didn't know we'd parked less than a quarter mile from something the Shoshone people had been warning about for generations. Something they called the hashtag guy, the bone whistler. And we definitely didn't know that the old mining camps were the worst possible places to be when it came hunting. The scratching started around 1 a.m. I woke up to it first. This sound like fingernails on metal, coming from the passenger side of the van. My first thought was an animal, maybe a coyote, or even a desert fox checking us out. It happened sometimes, but then I heard it move, deliberate and slow, from the front well toward the back. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Too methodical for an animal. Marisol stirred next to me. "You hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, reaching for my phone to use the flashlight. The scratching stopped the second I moved. We both lay there in the dark, listening. The wind had died down completely, and that's when I noticed how quiet it was. No insects, no distant highway sounds, nothing. Just this oppressive silence that made my ears ring. Then we heard the whistle. It started low, almost below hearing range, but it grew. Not like wind through rocks or metal. This was musical, intentional. A rising and falling tone that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Marisol grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "What the hell is that?" she said, and I could hear the fear in her voice. She'd been a trauma nurse for 12 years. She didn't scare easy. I got up, moving slowly to the front of the van, and peeked through the windshield. The moon was about 3/4 full, giving enough light to see the landscape. The scrubby desert, the dark shapes of the old mining buildings, the mountains in the distance. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then something moved near the old shaft house. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin in a way that wasn't right. The proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, torso too narrow. It moved with this jerky, stop-motion quality, like it was skipping frames. And it was white. Not pale white, but bleached bone white, almost luminous in the moonlight. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing, and then every instinct I had was screaming at me to start the van and get the hell out of there. Garrett, Marisol's voice was shaking now. She'd come up behind me and was looking over my shoulder. Tell me you see that too. I did. We both did. The thing stopped moving and turned toward our van. I couldn't make out features from that distance, but I felt it looking at us. Actually felt it, like a physical pressure. Then it started walking toward us, and that whistle got louder. Not just one tone anymore, but harmonics like a whole choir of flutes, all slightly out of tune. It was the most disturbing sound I'd ever heard. I lunged for the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, and died. No, I muttered, trying again. Nothing. The battery was fine. The lights worked, the dash lit up, but the engine wouldn't catch. Marisol was already on her phone. No signal, she said, her voice tight with panic. Garrett, we have no signal out here. The thing was maybe 50 yards away now, and I could see it better. Its skin wasn't just white. It had this texture like it was covered in a fine layer of ash or powder. The head was elongated, skull-like, with deep black hollows where eyes should be. And the mouth, Jesus, the mouth was open in this permanent grin, showing way too many teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. Its hands were wrong too, fingers too long, and ending in what looked like bone spurs instead of nails. Lock the doors, I told Marisol, which was stupid because our locks weren't going to stop that thing if it really wanted in. But it made us feel like we were doing something. The whistling changed pitch, became almost interrogative, like it was asking a question. The thing tilted its head, that jerky motion again, and I realized it was studying us the same way we were studying it. Then it did something that made my blood freeze. It stopped about 20 feet from the van and crouched down, folding those two long legs under itself. It reached down and picked up something from the ground. I couldn't tell what. And it started scratching in the dirt, drawing something. The whistling continued, but now there was a rhythm to it, almost like words in a language I couldn't understand. Marisol was hyperventilating next to me. I grabbed her hand and squeezed, tried to ground both of us. We're okay, I lied. We're in the van, we're safe. But I didn't believe it. I tried the engine again. Still nothing. The electrical systems were fine, but it was like something was preventing the spark plugs from firing. The creature finished whatever it was drawing and stood up. It looked at its work, then back at us, and it made this sound. Not the whistle anymore, but something like laughter. High-pitched, broken, horrible. Then it started walking around the van in a wide circle, never taking those hollow eyes off us, still whistling that awful multi-tone song. We were being hunted, I realized. This wasn't random. It had found us, and it had some kind of plan. The circling went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Round and round the van, always keeping that same distance, always whistling. Marisol was crying now, quiet tears running down her face, but she wasn't making a sound. We'd both figured out that noise seemed to interest this thing, and we were trying to be as still and silent as possible. Then it stopped directly in front of the van, maybe 10 feet from the windshield. Up close like this, I could see details I wish I hadn't. The ash-like substance covering it wasn't ash at all. It was some kind of mineral deposit like calcium or lime, coating its skin. There were marks on it too, old scars or symbols carved or burned into flesh. And the smell that started seeping into the van. God, it was like opening an old tomb, all dust and decay, and something sweet rotten underneath. It raised one of those elongated hands and pointed at me. Not at the van, at me specifically. The whistle changed again, became almost melodic, and I felt this overwhelming urge to open the door, to go out there, to follow it. My hand actually moved toward the door handle before Marisol grabbed it. Don't, she hissed. Garrett, don't you dare. The creature tilted its head again, like it was disappointed. Then it moved to Marisol's side of the van and pointed at her. The whistle shifted, became softer, more seductive. I watched her face go slack, saw her eyes glaze over. Marisol, I shook her hard. Stay with me. She blinked, came back, and started sobbing. It was in my head, she whispered. It was showing me things, telling me to come out. It said it was lonely. It said it just wanted to talk. That's when I remembered what the old guy at the gas station had said. Stay on pavement. This thing, whatever it was, it had rules, boundaries. And we crossed one by coming out here to the old mining camp. I looked around desperately, trying to figure out what to do. The keys were in the ignition, but the engine still wouldn't start. Our phones were useless. We had maybe a quarter tank of propane left, enough to run the heater for a few more hours. But then what? The creature backed away from the van and returned to the spot where it had been drawing in the dirt. In the moonlight, I could just make out what had scratched there. Bones. A pile of bones arranged in a pattern. And around them, smaller shapes that might have been more of those things or might have been people. The message was clear enough. Around 3 a.m., the whistling stopped, just cut off mid-tone, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. The creature stood motionless in front of the van, not moving, barely seeming to breathe if it breathed at all. Marisol and I hadn't spoken in over an hour. We just sat there, watching it, waiting for whatever came next. Then I heard something else. An engine, distant but getting closer. Headlights appeared on the dirt road, bouncing as a vehicle made its way toward us. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and for the first time, it showed something like emotion. Its mouth closed, the grin disappearing, replaced by what looked like anger or maybe fear. It let out one more whistle, this one sharp and accusatory, then it moved. But it didn't run away. It ran toward the headlights. I watched in horror as this thing sprinted. And I mean sprinted, covering ground faster than anything that size should be able to move, straight at the approaching vehicle. The headlights swerved. There was a sound like metal hitting metal. And then the vehicle's horn started blaring, one long continuous note. "Start the van," Marisol said urgently. "Try it now." I did, not expecting anything, but the engine caught immediately, roaring to life like nothing had been wrong. I didn't question it. I threw the van in reverse, backed up in a wild arc, then shifted to drive and punched it toward the road. As we bounced over the rough terrain, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of the other vehicle. A pickup truck, its front end crumpled, the horns still blaring. And on top of the hood, that creature, its two long arms raised, mouth open in a silent scream. We hit the paved highway doing 60 and didn't slow down until we reached Goldfield, the next town south. It was almost 4 a.m. when we pulled into a truck stop, parked under the brightest lights we could find, and just sat there shaking. Marisol was the first to speak. "That person in the truck," she said. "We have to call someone." I tried. Called 911, told them there'd been an accident on the mining road outside Tonopah, gave them the best directions I could. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but said they'd send someone to check. We waited at that truck stop until sunrise, drinking bad coffee and jumping at every sound. When we finally got back on the road, heading south and not looking back, Marisol made me promise we'd stick to busy campground from then on. Paid spots with other people around. I agreed immediately. We heard later, not from official sources, but from other Vanlife folks online, that they'd found the truck. It was registered to the old guy from the gas station, the one who'd warned us. They found the vehicle, but never found him. The official story was that he must have wandered off into the desert, maybe hit his head in the accident and got disoriented. But there was no blood, no signs of injury. Just his truck with the front end bashed in and these long scratches down both sides, like something with bone claws had been trying to get in. We left Nevada the next day and haven't been back. Marisol still has nightmares about that whistle. And sometimes, when we're camped somewhere remote and the wind picks up, I see her tense up, listening, waiting. We tell ourselves it was some kind of desert hermit, maybe someone who'd been living in those old mines for years and had gone feral. Our rational minds want that explanation, but we both know what we saw. We both know what tried to lure us out of that van. And we both know that the old man drove out there in the middle of the night, not by accident, but because he knew what was hunting us. He saved our lives, and whatever that thing was took him instead. That's something we have to live with now. That's the price we paid for ignoring the warnings and thinking we knew better than the locals. Some places have rules for a reason. Some warnings aren't superstition, they're survival. My name is Sienna Vaughn. I'm 34 years old, and I lived in Portland, Oregon before I decided the Pacific Northwest rain was going to drown me, literally and figuratively. I've been working as a freelance graphic designer, spending 16 hours a day in a studio apartment that cost more than my parents' mortgage, and one day, I just snapped. Sold everything, bought a beat-up 1987 Volkswagen Westphalia that leaked when it rained and overheated in traffic and pointed it south. I'd been solo vanning for about 9 months when I met Crosby at a campground outside Santa Fe. He was 51, this weathered ex-petroleum engineer who'd taken early retirement and bought a massive Class A motorhome that he clearly had no idea how to drive. I watched him try to back into a spot for 20 minutes before I went over to help. We got to talking, and he mentioned he was heading to Marfa, Texas. Said he wanted to see the mystery lights before he got too old to appreciate them. I'd heard about Marfa, the art scene, and the weird lights in the desert, and it sounded like exactly the kind of place I needed to see. We decided to caravan down together. Safety in numbers and all that. What neither of us knew was that the Marfa lights weren't the only unexplained phenomenon in that part of West Texas. The locals don't talk about the other thing much, especially not to tourists. They call it La Lechuza when they do mention it, the owl woman. Mexican folklore that crossed the border generations ago and took root in the Chihuahuan Desert. The stories say she's a witch who transforms into a giant owl, 7 feet tall with a woman's face, and she hunts people who travel alone at night. She calls to them in the voice of a crying baby or a screaming woman, lures them out, and then tears them apart. We didn't know any of that when we pulled off Highway 67, about 15 miles east of Marfa, looking for a place to camp for the night. It was early November, and the desert was cold after sunset, that dry, penetrating cold that gets into your bones. Crosby's RV needed a flat spot with enough room to level out, and I just needed somewhere I could park without worrying about my van sliding down a hill. We found this old ranch road that led to an abandoned homestead, just some crumbling adobe walls and a dried-up stock tank. The land was flat, the views were incredible, and we had the place to ourselves. Perfect, we thought. Crosby set up his RV with all its bells and whistles, slide-outs extended, satellite dish deployed, generator humming. My setup was considerably simpler. Park, crack a window, light my camping stove. We made dinner together outside, Crosby grilling steaks on his fancy propane setup while I made salad. The sun went down in this explosion of orange and red, and for a while, everything felt peaceful. We talked about our lives before the road, about where we were headed next, about whether we'd ever go back to normal jobs and normal houses. Around 9, we said good night, and I crawled in my van while Crosby buttoned up his RV. I was reading on my phone, trying to get sleepy, when I heard the first cry. It sounded like a baby, a newborn, maybe a few months old, absolutely wailing with distress. My first instinct was confusion, because we were in the middle of nowhere, at least 5 miles from the nearest occupied structure. Then I thought maybe it was an animal, a coyote, or a bobcat. They can make sounds that are eerily human sometimes. But this was too perfect, too exactly like a human infant in distress. And it was coming from somewhere near those old adobe ruins, maybe 50 yards from where we were parked. I sat up in my van listening. The crying continued, desperate and heartbreaking, and I felt this pull to go check it out. What if someone had abandoned a baby out here? What if there had been an accident we hadn't seen? My rational mind was screaming that this made no sense, but the sound was so convincing, so distressing, that I found myself reaching for my shoes. Then I heard Crosby's voice, muffled through his RV walls. "Do you hear that?" I climbed down my van and walked the few feet to his door. He opened it, and I could see he was pale, troubled. "Tell me I'm not crazy," he said. "That sounds like a baby crying, right?" I nodded, and we both stood there listening to it. The crying would stop for a few seconds, then start again, each time sounding slightly closer to our vehicles. "Should we check it out?" I asked, though every instinct I had was saying no. Crosby shook his head. "Something's not right." "That's not. I don't know, Sienna. It doesn't feel right." He was a practical guy, an engineer who dealt in facts and data, and hearing him talk about feelings made me take it seriously. We decided to wait, to watch from the safety of the vehicles and see if we could spot anything. The crying moved again, definitely closer now, maybe 30 yards away. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the desert scrub. Nothing, just creosote bushes, prickly pear rocks. But the crying continued, and now I could hear something else underneath it. A rustling sound, like large wings dragging through sand. Crosby heard it too. "Get in your van," he said quietly. "Lock the doors. I'm going to try my radio, see if I can raise anyone." I did what he said, climbing back into my Westphalia and locking everything. My hands were shaking. The crying had changed pitch now, becoming more urgent, more desperate, and it was so close I felt like I could reach out and touch whatever was making that sound. I peered through my window, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a big bird, an owl maybe, standing on the ground near one of the adobe walls. But then it stood up and up and up, and I realized this thing was massive. It had to be 6 or 7 feet tall, with wings that spanned at least 12 feet when it stretched them out. The body was covered in mottled brown and gray feathers, but the head, God, the head was wrong. It was owl-shaped, sure, with those big forward-facing eyes and a hooked beak, but the eyes were too human, too aware, and there was something about the facial structure that made my skin crawl. It looked at my van, those huge eyes reflecting my flashlight beam back at me in this eerie green glow, and the crying stopped. What came out of its beak instead was a woman's voice, clear as day. "Help me, please help me. Something's wrong with my baby." I dropped my flashlight and scrambled backward in my van, crashing into my little camping stove and sending it clattering. The voice came again. It sounded so sincere, so desperate. "Please, I need help. My baby isn't breathing." But I was watching this thing's beak move, watching the words come out of this creature that was absolutely not human, and my mind was trying to reject what I was seeing. Then Crosby's RV lights all came on at once, flooding the area with light. I heard his generator rev up, and his voice came over some kind of PA system he had installed. "Sienna, stay inside. Do not open your door." The creature turned toward his RV, cocked its head, and let out this shriek that made my ears ring. Not the baby crying anymore, not the woman's voice. This was pure predatory rage, high-pitched and piercing, like metal tearing. It launched itself at Crosby's RV, wings spread, talons extended. I watched it hit the side of his vehicle with a sound like a car crash. Those talons, and they were massive, easily 8 inches long, scoring deep gouges in the fiberglass. Crosby must have been ready for it, because I heard a loud bang and saw the creature fall back, shrieking again. He'd shot at it, probably with that hunting rifle he'd mentioned having. The thing landed in the dirt, stumbled, and I thought maybe Crosby had hit it. But it recovered fast, too fast, and took off into the air with powerful wing beats that kicked up dust and debris. It circled overhead, and I could hear it calling, not with the baby voice or the woman's voice, but with this rapid clicking sound like it was echolocating or maybe calling for others. "Sienna." Crosby's voice came through his PA again. "Start your van. We need to get out of here now." I lunged for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. The VW's engine turned over reluctantly. It always did, coughing and sputtering before finally catching. I looked up through my windshield and saw 3 more of those things circling overhead, their massive wings blotting out the stars. Crosby's RV started moving, pulling forward without bothering to retract his slide-outs or bring in his satellite dish. I heard metal tearing as the slide-outs caught on something, but he didn't stop. I threw my van in gear and followed, bouncing over the rough ground as we made our way back toward the ranch road. One of the creatures dove at my van, talons outstretched, and I screamed as it hit my roof with a deafening bang. The van shuddered, but kept moving. We hit the ranch road doing 30, which was insane for the rough terrain, but neither of us cared. Crosby's RV was shedding parts. I could see his satellite dish hanging by cables, sparks flying as his destroyed slide-outs dragged against the frame. The creatures were following us, 4 of them now, swooping and diving, their shrieks filling the night air. One of them landed on the hood of my van, and I got a close look at its face through the windshield. The eyes were definitely human. Not just human-like, but actually human, with that same awareness and intelligence you see when you look someone in the eye. The beak opened and a woman's voice came out, but the words were in Spanish now, rapid and angry, and though I didn't speak Spanish, I understood the tone. This thing was threatening me, cursing me, promising me pain. I swerved hard left, then right, trying to shake it off. Its talons were dug into my hood, punching through the metal, and it wasn't budging. So out of the only thing I could think of, I slammed on my brakes. The creature tumbled forward, crashed into my windshield hard enough to crack it, then rolled off onto the road. I gunned the engine and felt a sickening bump as I ran over it. In my rearview mirror, I saw it get back up, apparently unhurt, and take flight again. We were almost to the highway now, maybe a quarter mile. Crosby's RV was pulling ahead. That big diesel engine was powerful when you didn't care about safety or fuel economy, and I was trying to keep up in my ancient VW. The creatures were getting more aggressive, like they knew they were running out of time. Two of them grabbed onto my roof rack, and I felt my van start to lift off the ground. Actually lift like they were trying to carry me away. I panicked and started swerving violently, fishtailing on the dirt road. One of them lost its grip, but the other held on. My van tilted at this crazy angle, 2 wheels off the ground, and I thought I was going to flip. Then there was a gunshot. Crosby had his window down and was shooting behind him, and the creature on my roof shrieked and let go. My van crashed back down, and I nearly lost control, but managed to keep it on the road. The highway appeared ahead, blessed pavement, and we both hit it at speed. Crosby turned right without signaling, without slowing down, and I followed. The creatures pursued us onto the highway, but once we got up to 50, 60, 70 miles per hour, they started falling back. Maybe they had range limits, or maybe they didn't like being out in the open where cars might see them. I don't know. But after about 5 minutes of flat-out driving, they were gone. We didn't stop until we reached Marfa proper, pulling into the parking lot of the only gas station that was still lit up. It was almost 11 p.m., and the place was closed, but the lights were on, and there were security cameras, and that felt safe enough. Crosby climbed out of his RV, and I got out of my van, and we just stood there in the fluorescent glow, looking at each other. His RV was trashed. The slide-outs were torn off, hanging by hydraulic lines and electrical cables. The satellite dish was gone completely. There were deep gouges all along both sides, and one of his windows was shattered. My van wasn't much better. The hood was punched full of holes, the windshield was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, the roof rack was bent and partially torn off, and there were scratches everywhere, deep furrows in the paint and metal. What the hell were those things? Crosby finally asked, and his voice was shaking. He was an engineer, a rational man, and he'd just had his entire worldview shattered. I shook my head. I don't know, but they were hunting us. They were trying to take us. We compared notes on what we'd seen and heard. The baby crying, the woman's voice, the way they'd worked together, coordinating their attacks. These weren't just animals. They were intelligent, strategic, and they'd almost gotten us. A sheriff's deputy pulled into the parking lot around midnight, probably responding to a call about 2 damaged vehicles parked suspiciously at a closed gas station. We tried to explain what happened, that we'd been attacked by large birds, that we'd been camping east of town. The deputy listened with this patient, knowing expression, and when we were done, he said, "You folks were out by the old Quintana homestead, weren't you?" We nodded. He sighed. "Yeah, locals know better than to camp out there. Should have asked around before you set up." When we pushed him for details, asked what those things were, he got uncomfortable. "Look, I can't tell you what to believe," he said. "But this is old country, lots of history, lots of stories. Mexican families around here, they've been dealing with La Lechuza for generations. Most folks just know to stay clear of certain areas after dark." He told us the Quintana place had a reputation, that the last family who'd lived there back in the 50s had all disappeared one night. Parents and 3 kids never found. He told us about hikers who'd gone missing over the years, always solo, always at night. He told us about the sounds people reported, the crying babies and screaming women that led them out into the desert. And he told us, in this very matter-of-fact way, that we were lucky we'd had Crosby's RV, that the creatures seemed to have trouble with larger vehicles, preferred easier prey. "So what do we do?" I asked. "Do we report this? File a complaint?" The deputy actually laughed at that. Reported to who? And say what? That you were attacked by owl women? No, ma'am. You go get your vehicles fixed. You tell people you hit a deer or had an accident on a dirt road, and you don't camp in remote areas around here anymore. That's what you do. We stayed in Marfa for 3 days while we got emergency repairs done. Crosby's insurance covered his RV as an accident with wildlife, and I paid out of pocket to get my van drivable again. We didn't talk much about what happened. There wasn't much to say. We'd seen what we'd seen, and talking about it just made it feel more real and more impossible at the same time. On the 3rd day, an old woman approached me at the coffee shop where I was working on my laptop. She was maybe 80, hunched and weathered, and she sat down at my table without asking. "You're the girl who camped at Quintana," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, wary. She reached in her bag and pulled out this small charm, a glass I set in silver, hanging from a leather cord. "Ojo Dovenado," she said. "Deer's eye. You wear this. It protects you from her sight. She can't see you if you carry this." I tried to refuse, but she pressed it into my hand. "You are marked," she said. "When she looks at you, she remembers you. She'll find you again if you come back to this area. So don't come back. And if you must, you wear that." Then she got up and left before I could ask her anything else. Didn't even buy coffee. Just disappeared into the street. Crosby and I said goodbye that afternoon. He was heading east to Louisiana to stay with his daughter for a while, get his RV properly repaired. I was going west to California, putting as much distance between myself and West Texas as possible. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch, but we both knew we probably wouldn't. Some experiences bond you together, but others are so traumatic you can't bear to be reminded of them. I still have that charm the old woman gave me. I wear it every day, tucked under my shirt where no one can see it. I've been through Arizona, California, up and down the coast, and I haven't had any problems. But I still won't camp alone in remote areas after dark. I stick to campgrounds now, places with lights and other people. And when I hear a baby crying in the distance or a woman screaming for help, I don't investigate. I lock my doors, I turn up my music, and I remind myself that some things out there aren't what they seem. Crosby sent me a message about 6 months after Marfa. Just one line: "I sold the RV, got an apartment in Baton Rouge. Some things aren't worth the adventure." I understood completely. The Vanlife dream is about freedom, about exploration, about connecting with nature and finding yourself on the open road. But that night outside Marfa taught me that nature includes things we don't understand, things that don't fit in our modern worldview. The indigenous people knew about them, respected them, avoided them. We thought we were smarter, thought we could go anywhere we wanted. We were wrong. And that knowledge, that fundamental understanding that we're not the apex predators we think we are, that changes you. I'm still out here, still living in my van, still chasing sunsets and new horizons. But I'm more careful now, more respectful. And when locals give me warnings about where not to camp, I listen. Because I know firsthand what happens when you don't. My name is Nolan Cross. I'm 47 years old, and I used to live in Sacramento, California, where I worked as a high school history teacher for 23 years. The divorce finalized in March, and by April I'd sold a house, split everything down the middle with my ex-wife Rachel, and bought myself a 2015 Ram ProMaster that I converted into a camper. My daughter Ivy, she's 26, thought I was having a midlife crisis. Maybe I was. But after 2 decades of routine and responsibility, I needed to feel like my life was mine again. I've been on the road for about 5 months when I decided to visit Bodie, the old gold mining ghost town up near the Nevada border. I'm a history teacher, or was, and Bodie is one of those places that's perfectly preserved, frozen in time since the early 1900s. It's a state park now, and during the day it's full of tourists taking pictures of the old saloons and houses. But I wanted to see it differently. I wanted to camp nearby and visit at sunrise, see it without the crowds, feel the history in a more intimate way. The park ranger I talked to when I visited during operating hours was this woman in her 50s, stern-faced and professional. When I mentioned I was planning to camp somewhere nearby and come back at dawn, she got this look. "You planning to camp on BLM land around here?" she asked. I said, "Yeah, probably somewhere with a view of the town." She shook her head slowly. "Listen, I can't tell you what to do on public land, but I can tell you that locals don't camp within sight of Bodie. There's a reason for that." I pressed her for details, but she wouldn't elaborate, just said something vague about the town having a bad history and restless energy. I figured she was playing up the ghost town angle for atmosphere, maybe trying to keep people from camping illegally too close to the park boundaries. So I thanked her and went on my way, planning to find a spot on one of the dirt roads that crisscrossed the high desert around the town. It was late September, and at 8,400 feet elevation, the nights were already getting seriously cold. I found this perfect spot about 2 miles from Bodie, on a small rise that gave me a clear view of the town in the distance. You could see the old wooden buildings silhouetted against the sagebrush hills, the church steeple, the mine structures. It was beautiful in that desolate, melancholy way that old ghost towns have. I set up camp around 5 p.m., made myself dinner on my camp stove, and settled in to watch the sunset. That's when I noticed the dog. It was sitting maybe 50 yards from my van, just watching me. Medium-sized, looked like maybe a shepherd mix, brown and gray fur. At first I thought it might be a coyote, but the proportions were wrong. Too stocky, ears too floppy. Definitely a domestic dog, or had been at some point. I called to it, made those clicking sounds people make to attract dogs, but it didn't move. Just sat there, staring at me with these weirdly intense eyes. I figured it was a stray, maybe got separated from some campers. It looked thin but not emaciated, and there was something odd about the way it held itself. Too still, too focused. I got some jerky from my supplies and walked toward it slowly, holding out the food. "Hey buddy," I called. "You hungry?" The dog watched me approach, didn't move, didn't react. When I got within about 20 feet, it stood up, turned around, and started walking toward Bodie. Then it stopped, looked back at me, and sat down again, like it was waiting for me to follow. I've always been a skeptical person, a man of facts and evidence. But standing there in the fading light, watching that dog wait for me with such obvious intention, I felt uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. It was like the animal was trying to communicate something to lead me somewhere. Every rational part of my brain said this was just a lost dog with no particular agenda. But there was something in its behavior, something deliberate and knowing, that made my skin prickle. I decided not to follow it. I walked back to my van, and when I looked again, the dog was gone. Just vanished into the scrubland like it had never been there. I told myself it had wandered off, that I'd lost sight of it in the failing light. But I've been watching that area, and there was nowhere for a dog to hide that quickly. The unease stayed with me as darkness fell and the temperature dropped into the 30s. I was inside my van by 7 p.m., running my little propane heater and reading a book about Bodie's history that I'd picked up at the visitor center. The town had been rough in its heyday. Murders, gunfights, fires, all the violence and desperation that came with gold rush boom towns. But what struck me was a chapter about the decline years, the 1920s and 30s, when most people had left but a few stragglers remained. There were reports from that era of strange occurrences, people seeing figures in windows of abandoned buildings, hearing voices and footsteps when no one was around. Some of the last residents claimed the town was haunted by those who died violently there, that the spirits were angry about being forgotten. I was reading about a particularly nasty murder from 1881, a man who'd killed his business partner and hidden the body in an old mine shaft, when I heard scratching at my van door. Soft at first, then more insistent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I looked up from my book, heart suddenly pounding. "Hello." I called out. The scratching stopped. I waited, listening. Nothing. Then it started again, same rhythm, same intensity. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. The dog was back, sitting right next to my door, one paw raised like it was about to scratch again. In the beam of my flashlight, its eyes reflected green, and I could see its mouth was open, panting. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. It was below, freezing outside, and I couldn't see the dog's breath. No vapor, no condensation. Like it wasn't breathing at all, just going through the motions. I sat there frozen, watching this dog that might not be a dog. It scratched again, then stood up and walked a few feet away. Sat down, looked back at me. The same gesture as before, like it wanted me to follow. I checked my phone, no service out here, which I'd expected, and thought about my options. I could stay in the van and ignore it, or I could start the engine and leave. What I should not do, what every horror movie ever made told me not to do, was go outside and follow a creepy, maybe not real dog into the darkness. The scratching continued on and off for the next hour. The dog would scratch at my door, wait, walk away, come back, repeat. Sometimes it would disappear for 10 or 15 minutes, and I think it was finally gone, but then I'd hear that scratch, scratch, scratch again. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something else. There were lights in Bodie. Not the security lights the Park Service maintained. These were different. They looked like lantern light, warm and flickering, visible in the windows of several buildings. I knew for a fact that Bodie was closed, that no one was supposed to be there after dark. The Park Service was strict about that. So either someone was trespassing, or I didn't want to think about or I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the town. The lights were definitely there, and I could see movement in some of the windows. Shadows passing back and forth, like people going about their evening routines in buildings that had been abandoned for decades. The dog was sitting in front of my van now, perfectly still, facing toward Bodie. As I watched, it stood up and started walking toward the town. This time it didn't look back, didn't wait for me. It just walked with purpose, heading straight for those flickering lights. I tracked it with my binoculars until it disappeared into the darkness between my position and the town. Then I heard the voices, faint at first, carried on the wind. Men shouting, a woman laughing, the sound of a piano playing something jaunty and off-key. Saloon sounds, like the town was alive again, populated by the ghosts of its violent past. I knew I should be terrified, should start my van and get the hell out of there. But I'm a historian, and some part of me was fascinated. This was history coming alive, the past asserting itself in the present. I wanted to understand it, to witness it, even as my rational mind screamed at me to run. I made a decision that I knew was stupid even as I was making it. I got dressed in warm layers, grabbed my flashlight and my phone, and stepped out of the van. The cold hit me immediately, biting and sharp at this elevation. The sound from Bodie were clearer now. Definitely voices, definitely music, the general hubbub of an active frontier town. And I could see more lights, dozens of them, like the whole town was lit up and occupied. I started walking toward it. Not because I wanted it exactly, but because I felt pulled. The same way the dog had been trying to pull me all evening. With each step, the sounds got louder, more distinct. I could hear conversations now. Couldn't make out words, but could hear the rhythms of speech. I could smell wood smoke and something else, something organic and unpleasant underneath like rotting meat. I got about halfway to the town, maybe a mile from my van, when I saw the dog again. It was sitting in the middle of the dirt road, blocking my path. Behind it, I could see figures moving between the buildings, actual people, or at least things that looked like people. They were dressed in period clothing, 1800 style, and they seemed solid and real. One of them saw me and pointed, and several others turned to look. The figures started moving toward me, not running, just walking with a steady, inevitable pace. There were maybe a dozen of them, men and women, all in old-fashioned clothing, all with faces that were somehow wrong. Even at this distance, I could see their eyes were too dark, their skin too pale, their movements too stiff. They looked like corpses that had been made to walk, like something was puppeting dead bodies through the motions of life. The dog growled. It was the first sound I'd heard it make, this low, rumbling warning that vibrated in my chest. It was growling at the figures, not at me, and I understood in that moment that this animal, whatever it was, had been trying to warn me, not lure me. All that scratching, that insistent behavior, it had been trying to get my attention, to make me aware of the danger. I backed up slowly, not taking my eyes off the approaching figures. They were close enough now that I could see details, a woman with her throat cut, the wound gaping and bloodless, a man with half his skull caved in, another man with rope burns around his neck and his head twisted at an unnatural angle. These were the violent dead of Bodie, the murdered and the executed, the victims of the town's brutal history. And they were coming for me. Run. The word came from behind me, and I spun around. There was a man standing there, or the ghost of a man. He was younger than the others, maybe in his 30s, dressed in work clothes from the 1920s or 30s. He was translucent enough that I could see the landscape through him, but his face was kind, concerned. "You need to run, son. They're waking up more of them. The whole town's coming." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, sprinting back toward my van. Behind me, I could hear the sounds changing, the saloon music cutting off, the voices rising in anger, the sound of many feet starting to run. I risked a look back and saw dozens of them now, pouring out of the buildings, a mob of the dead chasing me across the high desert. The dog was running alongside me, matching my pace exactly. The translucent man was ahead of us, beckoning urgently. "Faster," he called. "Don't let them touch you." I put on a burst of speed I didn't know I had, my lungs burning in the thin air, my legs screaming. The van was maybe a quarter-mile ahead, and I'd never been so grateful for my decision to park close by. I could hear them behind me, closer than they should be, and the smell was overwhelming now, decay and rot and something chemical like formaldehyde. I didn't look back again, just focused on the van, on getting there, on surviving this. The dog pulled ahead, reaching the van first and sitting next to the driver's door. The translucent man was there too, gesturing frantically. I reached the van and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. The mob was maybe 30 yards behind me, close enough that I could hear individual voices now, all of them saying the same thing in different tones. "Stay. Stay with us. Join us." I got the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut just as the first of them reached the van. Hands slapped against the windows, dead hands with gray skin and broken fingernails. Faces pressed against the glass, those two dark eyes staring at me with hunger and rage and something that might have been loneliness. I started the engine, thank God it caught on the first try, and threw it in reverse. The van lurched backward, and I felt sickening thumps as I hit some of them. They didn't fall or stumble, just kept coming, kept reaching for me. I spun the wheel, shifted into drive, and punched the accelerator. The van fishtailed on the dirt road, then caught traction and leaped forward. In my rearview mirror, I could see the mob still following, running at impossible speeds, keeping pace with my van even as I hit 30, 40 miles per hour. But gradually, slowly, they started to fall behind. By the time I reached 50, they'd given up the chase, stopping in the middle of the road and just watching me go. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, didn't feel safe until I reached the town of Bridgeport, 25 miles north. It was after 11 p.m. when I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking, my heart still racing. I sat there under the fluorescent lights, trying to process what had just happened, trying to convince myself it had been real and not some altitude-induced hallucination. But it was real. I knew it was real because when I checked my van, there were handprints on the windows, dozens of them, palm prints and finger marks that looked like they'd been made with wet ash. And there were dents in my bumper and side panels from where I'd hit some of them. Whatever those things were, they'd been physical enough to leave evidence. I spent the night in a motel in Bridgeport, didn't sleep at all, just sat up watching TV and drinking bad coffee from the room's little machine. In the morning, I drove back toward Bodie, not to the town itself, but close enough to see it. In daylight, it looked exactly like it should. Abandoned wooden buildings, no lights, no movement, just a well-preserved ghost town waiting for the state park to open and tourists to arrive. The ranger station opened at 9 a.m., and I was waiting when the same woman from yesterday showed up. She took one look at me. I must have looked like hell, unshaven and wild-eyed, and sighed. "You camped within sight of the town," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She shook her head. "And you went walking toward it after dark." Another nod. "But you're here, so something stopped you. What was it?" I told her about the dog, about the translucent man who'd warned me to run. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The dog's name was Buck. He belonged to one of the last caretakers who lived in Bodie in the 1930s. The man you saw was probably James Cain, died in 1932, last person to be buried in the Bodhi Cemetery. The old-timers say they're guardians trying to protect people from the others, from the ones who died bad and stayed angry. She explained that Bodhi has rules, that the Chinese miners who worked there in the 1800s understood it, that the indigenous Paiute people had known about that land long before any white settlers arrived. The dead there are restless, she said, especially the ones who died violently. During the day, when the sun is up and tourists are around, they sleep or hide or whatever ghosts do. But at night, they wake up. And if they see you, if you're close enough and alone enough, they try to take you. They want company or revenge, or maybe just to make someone else feel the violence they felt. You were lucky, she told me. Most people who camp within sight of Bodhi and go walking toward it at night, we find their vehicles a few days later. Sometimes we find them too, wandering in the hills, not quite right in the head anymore. And sometimes we don't find them at all. They just disappear, and we add another name to the list of people who went missing near Bodhi. I asked her why the state didn't warn people, didn't put up signs. She gave me this tired look. Who would believe it? We'd sound crazy. And even if we did warn people, you think they'd listen? You got warned, and you camped there anyway. People think they know better, think the rules don't apply to them. She was right, of course. I'd been arrogant, dismissive of local knowledge, certain that my rational worldview was more valid than their superstitions. Before I left Bridgeport, I went back one more time to where I'd camped. In the daylight, I could see things I'd missed the night before. Old beer cans and trash, evidence that other people had camped there. But I could also see something else. There were bones scattered in the sagebrush, human bones, old and weathered, but definitely human. A skull partially buried in the dirt, visible ribs, a pelvis. Someone had died here or been left here, and no one had ever found them or reported them. I didn't tell the ranger. I probably should have, but I was done with Bodhi, done with that whole area. I got in my van and drove south, didn't stop until I was out of the high desert and back into the foothills. I've been on the road for months since then, seen a lot of California, visited a lot of historical sites. But I've learned to respect local warnings, to listen when people tell me not to go somewhere or do something. The Vanlife community online, they talk a lot about freedom, about going anywhere you want, about making your own rules. And that's beautiful in theory. But the world is older and stranger than we like to admit, and there are places where the past doesn't stay buried, where the dead don't rest easy. Bodhi is one of those places. And now I know that some ghost towns are called ghost towns for reasons that have nothing to do with tourism or nostalgia. I still have nightmares about those faces pressed against my windows, about those voices telling me to stay. I wake up sometimes convinced I can hear scratching at my van door, and I have to turn on all the lights and check to make sure I'm alone. But I also think about that dog, about Buck, and about James Cain. They didn't have to help me. They could have let the mob take me. But they chose to intervene, chose to use whatever power or presence they still have to save a stranger who'd been too stupid to listen to warnings. That gives me some comfort, knowing that even in a place as dark as Bodhi, there's still something that cares enough to protect the living from the dead. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't before that night. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know I came closer to death or something worse than death than I ever want to again. So now when I plan where to camp, I do my research. I ask locals. I listen to warnings. And I never, ever camp within sight of a ghost town after dark. My name is Darrell Okonkwo. I'm 29 years old, and I lived in Oakland, California before I decided that working 60-hour weeks as a software engineer wasn't going to kill me, because I was going to quit first. I'd saved up enough money to take a year off, bought a 2018 Ford Transit that I converted myself, and hit the road with a vague plan to visit every national park in California. I'm the kind of person who researches everything to death, who reads reviews and checks weather forecasts obsessively, who always has a backup plan. That personality trait saved my life. I met Marcus at a climbing gym in Sacramento. He was 33, this easygoing photographer who'd been van living for 3 years and had the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from actually knowing what you're doing on the road. We started talking about routes and campsites, and when he mentioned he was heading up to the Redwood National and State Parks to shoot some photos, I said I'd been planning the same trip. He suggested we caravan up together, camp in the same areas, maybe hike some trails. It seemed like a good idea. Safety in numbers, someone to share campfire coffee with, that kind of thing. What neither of us knew was that the redwood forests of Northern California have their own folklore, stories that predate the Spanish missions and the gold rush by thousands of years. The Yurok people, the Toloa, the Chilala, they all had stories about the deep forest, about things that lived in the oldest groves where sunlight barely touched the ground. They had rules about where you could go and where you should never set foot, about trees that were sacred and trees that were cursed, about sounds you should ignore and offerings you should leave. We drove up Highway 101 in early October when the tourist season was winding down and the parks were quieter. Marcus knew about this dispersed camping area on an old logging road, deep in the Six Rivers National Forest, surrounded by old-growth redwoods that had somehow escaped the saw. He said he'd camped there before, that it was incredible. These massive trees, some of them over 1,000 years old, creating this cathedral-like atmosphere. It sounded perfect. We found the turnoff around 4 p.m., this barely marked dirt road that wound up into the hills. The forest closed in immediately, those massive redwoods blocking out the sky, their trunks so thick that 3 people linking hands couldn't circle them. The road got rougher the further we went, until we were basically crawling along at 5 miles per hour, dodging potholes and fallen branches. After about 3 miles, we reached a small clearing, just enough room for both our vans, surrounded on all sides by these ancient giants. Marcus was thrilled, already out of his van with his camera, taking shots of the light filtering through the canopy. I was more cautious, something about the place making me uneasy in a way I couldn't articulate. The silence was too complete, too heavy. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Just this oppressive quiet that seemed to absorb sound. But Marcus was so enthusiastic, and I didn't want to seem paranoid or ruin his shoot. So I kept my concerns to myself and started setting up camp. We made dinner together as the light faded, Marcus grilling vegetables on his camp stove while I made rice in my pressure cooker. The conversation was easy, comfortable, and for a while I forgot about my uneasiness. He told me about growing up in Detroit, about how he dropped out of art school to travel, about the best campsites he'd found in 3 years of wandering. I told him about my family, Nigerian immigrants who'd worked their whole lives so their kids could have opportunities, about the guilt I felt leaving a good job to find myself like some privileged cliche. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped fast. We were at maybe 2,000 feet elevation, and the forest held the cold like a refrigerator. Marcus built a small fire in the established fire ring, and we sat close to it, watching the flames dance. That's when I noticed the trees. In the firelight, their bark looked different, patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like writing or symbols carved into the wood. I pointed out to Marcus, and he took some photos, but he said it was probably just pareidolia, our brains finding patterns in random textures. Around 9 p.m., we heard the first sound. It came from deep in the forest, a low, groaning noise like wood creaking under strain. Marcus said it was probably just the trees settling, responding to temperature changes. The sound came again, longer this time, and there was something almost vocal about it, like a voice trying to form words. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. That doesn't sound like trees settling, I said. Marcus listened, and I could see uncertainty cross his face. The sound came a third time, and now was definitely closer, maybe 100 yards into the forest. We both stood up, staring into the darkness beyond our firelight. The flames were dancing weirdly now, flickering in directions that didn't match the wind. And I realized something else. There was no wind. The air was completely still, but the fire was moving like something was breathing on it. Maybe we should get in the vans, I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus nodded slowly, still staring at the forest. Yeah, that's probably smart. We doused the fire and retreated to our respective vans. I locked my doors and sat in the driver's seat, watching the clearing through my windshield. Marcus's van was maybe 20 feet from mine, and I could see him moving around inside, probably getting ready for bed. The groaning sounds continued, irregular intervals, sometimes close, sometimes distant. And then I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Something was standing between the trees, just at the limit of where my eyes could make out shapes in the darkness. It was tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, and it had the rough texture of bark like it was made from the forest itself, or like it was wearing the forest, camouflaged in wood and moss and shadow. It stood completely still, and I had the horrible certainty that it was watching us, studying us, deciding what to do with us. I grabbed my phone to text Marcus, hand shaking. Something's out there. Edge of clearing. Don't turn on your lights. I watched his van, saw the glow of his phone screen as he read the message. Then his interior lights went dark completely, and I knew he'd seen it too. My phone buzzed. What is that thing? The figure moved, stepping into the clearing with a strange, stuttering motion, like it was learning how to walk. It was definitely made of wood. I could see bark patterns, gnarled branches extending from its torso like misshapen arms, roots or vines hanging from its lower body like tentacles. But it moved with purpose, with intelligence, and the groaning sound was coming from it, from somewhere in its center, like a tree trunk being twisted until it screamed. It approached Marcus's van first, circling it slowly. I could see Marcus's silhouette inside, frozen, watching this thing examine his vehicle. It reached out one of those branch arms and dragged it along the side of the van with a horrible scraping sound. Then it moved to the back, to the rear doors, and it started pushing on them, testing them, trying to get in. Marcus's van rocked with the pressure. I could hear him moving inside, probably bracing himself against the interior walls. The creature pushed harder, and I heard metal groaning, saw the van suspension compress. It was strong, whatever it was, strong enough to tear the doors off if it wanted to. My mind was racing. Should I start my van, try to distract it, draw it away from Marcus? Should I honk my horn, make noise, try to scare it off? Before I could decide, the creature stopped pushing. It straightened up, tilted its head in this weirdly human gesture, and turned to look directly at my van. At me. It had no eyes that I could see, no face really, just rough bark and shadow, and a cavity in its trunk that might have been a mouth. But I felt its attention like a weight, like it was seeing through my windshield, through the metal and glass, directly into me. It started walking toward my van, that same stuttering motion and the groaning intensified. I fumbled with my keys, started the engine, threw it into reverse. The transit's backup camera showed the clearing behind me, the road we'd coming on. I could make it out if I was fast, if I didn't hit a tree or get stuck, but that would mean leaving Marcus. The creature was between us now, and if I ran, it would have him all to itself. My phone buzzed. Go. Get help. I'll be okay. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave him there. Instead, I laid on the horn, a long, continuous blast that shattered the silence. The creature stopped, maybe 15 feet from my van, and turned back toward Marcus. Then it did something that made my stomach drop. It split. Its trunk opened down the middle, revealing a hollow interior filled with what looked like thousands of small, writhing roots or tendrils, all moving independently, all reaching outward. From that hollow center came a sound like wind through a tunnel, and words formed, distorted and creaking, but unmistakably words. Leave the grove, leave, or become the grove. It was speaking to us, this thing made of wood and forest, and the threat was clear. We weren't welcome here. This place belonged to it, to them, to whatever these creatures were. I laid on the horn again, longer this time, and flashed my high beams. The creature recoiled from the light, pulling its trunk closed, backing away from my van. Marcus must have seen what I was doing because his van's horn joined mine, two discordant blasts echoing through the forest. And the creature retreated, backing toward the tree line, that groaning sound becoming almost like anger or frustration. But it wasn't alone anymore. As it reached the edge of the clearing, I saw others emerging from between the trees. 4, 5, 6 of them, all similar in structure but different in details. One was covered in moss, another had what looked like mushrooms growing from its bark, a third was blackened like it had been burned. They gathered at the edge of the clearing, watching us, and the groaning became a chorus, overlapping tones that created harmonics that hurt my ears and made my teeth ache. Then they started swaying, all of them together, rocking back and forth in unison. The trees around them began swaying too, like the whole forest was moving to some rhythm I couldn't hear. And the ground started to shift. I felt it through my van's tires. The earth was moving, churning like something underneath was waking up. Roots began breaking through the surface of the clearing, thick ropey things that writhed like snakes, reaching toward our vans. "We need to go now," I texted Marcus. His response was immediate. "Road's blocked. Something's blocking the road." I looked at my rear-view camera and saw he was right. There were more of those creatures behind us, standing on the logging road, their branch arms linked together, creating a barrier. We were surrounded. The roots were getting closer, some of them already wrapping around my tires. I threw the van into four-wheel drive, gunned the engine, and felt the tires spin trying to break free. Marcus was doing the same, his van rocking as he tried to power through. One of my tires caught traction, and I lurched forward a few feet before more roots grabbed hold. We were stuck. The creatures were advancing now, all of them, closing the circle. And I realized something horrible. They weren't going to kill us. They were going to take us, incorporate us into the forest, turn us into more of them. That's what the voice had meant. Become the Grove. This was their territory, their sacred space, and we'd violated it by being here. Now we'd pay the price. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my camping hatchet from the back of the van, threw open my door, and started hacking at the roots wrapped around my tires. They were tough, fibrous, but the hatchet was sharp and I was running on pure adrenaline and terror. Behind me, I heard Marcus's door open, heard him shouting something I couldn't make out over the groaning chorus. The nearest creature lunged at me, those branch arms reaching. I swung the hatchet wildly and connected with one of them, felt it bite into wood, heard a shriek that was definitely pain. The creature pulled back, and dark sap, or blood, or something, oozed from the wound. The others hesitated, and I realized they could be hurt, could feel pain. They weren't invulnerable. "Marcus!" I screamed. "They could be hurt. Fight back." I saw him emerge from his van with a tire iron, start beating at the roots around his wheels. The creatures were regrouping, communicating somehow, the groaning becoming more organized, more purposeful. We had maybe seconds before they rushed us all at once. I got back in my van, threw it in reverse, and floored it. The tires spun, shredded the remaining roots, and the transit shot backward. I felt impacts as I hit something, couldn't tell if it was roots or creatures, but I didn't stop. I heard Marcus's van engine roar, saw him doing the same thing, ramming through the blockade on the logging road. The creatures on the road scattered, moving faster than they had before, and suddenly the path was clear. I spun my wheel, fishtailed on the dirt road, and accelerated forward. In my rearview mirror, I saw Marcus following, his van weaving as he dodged, reaching branch arms. The creatures were chasing us now, running with that stuttering motion, faster than anything made of wood should be able to move. The logging road was a nightmare. Potholes, fallen branches, washouts. I was doing 30 miles per hour on a road that should have been taken at 5, and every bump threatened to blow a tire or snap an axle. Behind me, Marcus was keeping pace, and behind him, the creatures were falling back, but not stopping. They wanted us gone, wanted us out of their territory, and they were going to chase us until we were clear. It took maybe 10 minutes to reach the main forest road, though it felt like hours. When my tires hit pavement, I nearly cried with relief. Marcus pulled up beside me, and through his window, I could see he was pale, shaking, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We didn't stop, didn't even slow down, just kept driving until we reached the highway, until we were surrounded by other cars and streetlights and the ordinary safety of civilization. We pulled into a rest area somewhere south of Eureka, around midnight. Both our vans were trashed, scratches everywhere, dents in the panels, roots still tangled in the wheel wells. We got out and just stood there in the harsh fluorescent light, looking at the damage, looking at each other. "What the hell was that?" Marcus finally asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. I didn't have an answer. We spent the rest of the night at that rest area, parked under the lights, taking turns keeping watch. Neither of us could sleep. In the morning, we drove to a cafe in Eureka and sat drinking coffee, trying to process what had happened. Marcus kept looking at his photos from the clearing, the ones he'd taken before dark. In every single image, there were shapes between the trees that we hadn't seen at the time, tall, bark-covered forms, watching us set up camp. We were never alone there, he said quietly. They were watching us from the start. I pulled up information on my phone about the Six Rivers National Forest, about the indigenous tribes who'd lived there. Found references to something called the Stick Indians or Tree People, guardian spirits that protected sacred groves that would punish those who disturbed them. The descriptions matched what we'd seen almost perfectly. We reported the incident to the Forest Service, but we kept it vague, said we'd been threatened by people in the forest, that someone had tried to trap us on the logging road. The ranger we talked to gave us this look that said he knew we were leaving something out, but he didn't push. He did mention that there had been other reports from that area over the years, people feeling watched, hearing strange sounds, finding their camps disturbed. He suggested we'd just gotten spooked by the darkness and our own imaginations. Marcus and I parted ways after Eureka. He was heading east to Colorado, said he needed mountains and open sky for a while, couldn't handle forests anymore. I understood completely. I headed south back to the Bay Area, and I've stayed in urban areas ever since. My van conversion is perfect for city camping, and I've found I prefer parking lots and street corners to wilderness campsites. Sometimes I think about that clearing in the redwoods, about those creatures made of bark and root and ancient anger. I think about how close we came to becoming part of the forest, to being transformed into something that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite tree. And I think about all the people who go missing in national forests every year, the ones who are never found, the ones whose disappearances are chalked up to getting lost or having accidents. I wonder how many of them stumbled into sacred groves, into places that were meant to be left alone. How many of them ignored the warnings? Because there are always warnings if you know how to listen. The silence that's too complete, the absence of animals, the feeling of being watched. These are all signs that you're somewhere you shouldn't be, that you've crossed a boundary between the world we know and the older world that still exists in the deep places. The van life dream is about freedom, about connecting with nature, about finding yourself in wild places. But nature isn't always welcoming, and wild places have their own rules and their own guardians. I learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Now I stick to places where humans are meant to be, where the land has been domesticated and made safe. Because I know now that there are still wild places left in this world, places where the old powers still hold sway, and where humans are only tolerated as long as they show proper respect. My name is Fletcher Reeves. I'm 38 years old, and I used to live in Austin, Texas, where I worked as a paramedic for 11 years. I'd seen enough trauma, enough death, enough of humanity's worst moments that I needed to step away before it broke me completely. My therapist suggested a change of scenery, some time to decompress and process everything I'd witnessed. So I bought a used Chevy Express cargo van, did a basic conversion, just a bed, some storage and a portable stove, and started driving with no particular destination in mind. I've been on the road for about 3 months when I connected with this group of van lifers online who were planning a meetup in the Big Bend area. There were supposed to be 6 of us total, but by the time we were ready to head out, it was down to just 3. Me, a woman named Astrid who was 44 and had been teaching yoga while traveling for 2 years, and this kid named Rory, only 26, fresh out of college and doing the van thing before settling into a real job. We'd never met in person, but we'd been chatting in a group message for weeks, and it felt like we knew each other well enough. Big Bend is one of the most remote national parks in the lower 48 states. Hundreds of thousands of acres of Chihuahuan desert along the Rio Grande, bordering Mexico. It's beautiful in that harsh, unforgiving way that deserts are, all rock and cactus and endless sky. But it's also isolated. The nearest town of any size is hours away. Cell service is non-existent in most of the park, and if something goes wrong, help isn't coming quickly. We met up at the Panther Junction Visitor Center in late November, right as the winter season was starting. The park was quiet, most of the summer tourists long gone. Astrid had this vintage Airstream that looked like something from the 1960s, all aluminum curves and retro styling. Rory drove a converted school bus he'd painted in these bright, psychedelic colors. We spent the first evening at a developed campground, getting to know each other in person, sharing meals and stories around a fire. The next day, we decided to find somewhere more remote to camp. Astrid had researched this primitive camping area way out in the backcountry, accessible only by a rough four-wheel drive road. She said there was a spot near an old abandoned ranch, close to the river, with incredible views and total solitude. It sounded perfect. What none of us knew was that the area we were heading to had a reputation among locals, especially among the Mexican families who lived on the other side of the border. They called it El Valle de Los Perdidos, the Valley of the Lost, and they avoided it, especially after dark. We loaded up with extra water and supplies and headed out around noon. The road was brutal, deeply rutted, scattered with rocks, crossing dry washes that could become deadly flash floods if it rained. My van handled it okay, and Rory's bus was high enough to clear most obstacles, but Astrid's low-slung Airstream was struggling. We had to stop multiple times to scout the route, to stack rocks to create ramps, to winch her trailer over particularly rough sections. It took us 4 hours to cover 12 miles. By the time we reached the camping area, the sun was already low on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. The spot was everything Astrid had promised. A flat area surrounded by massive boulders, with a view down to the Rio Grande, maybe half a mile away. The old ranch ruins were nearby, just crumbling adobe walls and the skeleton of a windmill. Everything long abandoned and returning to dust. We set up camp quickly, trying to get everything secured before darkness fell. The temperature was already dropping. Desert nights get cold fast once the sun goes down. Rory got a fire going in a ring made from rocks we gathered, and Astrid started cooking this elaborate meal she'd planned, rice and beans and grilled vegetables. I contributed some beer from my cooler, and for a while, everything felt great. We were 3 strangers becoming friends, sharing this perfect moment in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. As we ate, Astrid mentioned something she'd read about the area. There's this local legend, she said, about people who cross the border out here and disappear. Not because of border patrol or cartels, but because of something else. The Mexican families call it El Silban, the Whistler, supposed to be this ghost or demon that wanders the desert at night, carrying a bag of bones, whistling this creepy tune. If you hear the whistle loud, it means he's far away. If you hear it quiet, he's right behind you. Rory laughed nervously. That's just a story to scare people, right? Astrid shrugged. Probably. But the article I read mentioned that a lot of people have gone missing in this area over the years. Hikers, border crossers, even some park rangers back in the day. More than you'd expect for a place this remote. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. In my years as a paramedic, I'd learned to trust my gut, and right now my gut was saying something was off about this place. Around 9 p.m., we heard the first whistle. It was faint, distant, barely audible over the crackling fire. A simple melody, just a few notes repeated over and over. We all stopped talking and listened. Probably just whined through the rocks, I suggested, though I didn't really believe it. The whistle came again, slightly different in pitch, like someone was varying the tune. Rory stood up, peering into the darkness beyond our firelight. That doesn't sound like wind, he said quietly. The whistling continued, irregular intervals, sometimes going silent for minutes before starting again. And each time it came back, it sounded subtly different, closer or farther, higher or lower, like it was moving around us in a wide circle. Astrid pulled out her phone, tried to record it, but there was something wrong with the audio. The recording played back as just static, even though we could clearly hear the whistling with our own ears. Then we heard something else. Footsteps, crunching on gravel and sand. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The kind of footsteps that suggested something large, moving with purpose. The whistling stopped, and in the sudden silence, we could hear those footsteps clearly. They were coming from the direction of the old ranch ruins, heading toward our camp. "Everyone get in your vehicles," I said, my paramedic training kicking in. In an emergency, you assess, you prioritize, you act. And my assessment was that we needed protection, walls between us and whatever was out there. Astrid and Rory didn't argue. We doused the fire, grabbed our essentials, and retreated to our respective vehicles. I locked myself in my van, watching through the windows. The footsteps continued, getting louder, closer. And now I could see movement in the darkness. A tall figure, maybe 7 feet, walking with a strange, shambling gait. It was carrying something over its shoulder, something large and heavy that swung as it walked. As it got closer to where our fire had been, I could make out more details in the moonlight. It looked human, sort of. The proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, body too thin, head tilted at an angle that would break a normal person's neck. It was wearing ragged clothes that might have been white once, but were now stained dark with what I hoped was dirt. And the thing it was carrying was a sack, burlap, or canvas, bulging with angular shapes that could have been bones. The figure stopped in the center of our camp, right where the fire had been. It set down the sack with a wet, heavy thud, and then it straightened up, turning its head slowly as if scanning the area. Looking for us. I held my breath, pressing myself against the side of my van, trying to be as still and quiet as possible. In my peripheral vision, I could see Astrid's Airstream and Rory's bus, both dark and silent. Then the whistling started again, but now it was coming from the figure itself. The sound was impossibly loud, echoing off the boulders around us, and the tune had changed. It was more complex now, almost like a song, with multiple notes weaving together. And underneath the whistling, I could hear words, Spanish words whispered or chanted, too quiet to make out clearly, but definitely there. The figure reached down to its sack and opened it. Even from 30 feet away, even in the darkness, I could see what spilled out. Bones. Human bones, skulls, femurs, ribs, all scattered across the ground in a pile. The figure knelt beside them and started arranging them in a pattern, placing them with care and precision, like it was building something or performing some kind of ritual. My phone buzzed. A text from Astrid in our group chat. "What is that thing?" Rory replied, "We need to leave right now." I agreed, but there was a problem. That figure was between us and the road out. If we started our engines, if we tried to drive past it, we'd have to get within a few feet of it. And I had no idea how it would react. The figure finished arranging the bones and stood up. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that was somehow worse. Then it spoke, and the voice was like rocks grinding together, ancient and inhuman. "Quien entra en mi valle?" Who enters my valley? It turned toward my van first, and I saw its face clearly for the first time. What I thought was a tilted head was actually a neck that had been broken or twisted, the head facing almost backward. The eyes were empty sockets, dark and deep, and the mouth was open far too wide, showing teeth that were filed to points. "You carry death with you," it said, still looking at my van. "I smell it on you. The many deaths you have witnessed. You understand what I am." It was talking to me, about my years as a paramedic. How could it know that? How could it sense the trauma I carried? It moved toward Rory's bus next. "You are young, full of life. Your bones would be strong, would serve me well." Rory's engine started with a roar, and his bus lurched forward, trying to make a run for it. The figure moved faster than anything that size should move, faster than seemed physically possible, and it grabbed the front of the bus with those two long arms. I heard metal shriek as it dug its fingers into the hood, and the bus shuddered to a stop, engine revving uselessly. "No," the figure said, almost gently. "You do not leave until I allow it." It pulled, and Rory's bus rocked violently. I heard him screaming inside, heard the engine cutting out. Astrid's Airstream started moving, trying to circle around, but the figure released the bus and turned its attention to her. The whistling started again, so loud it made my ears ring, and Astrid's trailer stopped dead, like the engine had been killed remotely. I did the only thing I could think of. I started my van, threw in reverse, and backed up fast, putting distance between myself and that thing. It turned to watch me, head tilting further at that impossible angle. "The death carrier runs," it said, and I heard amusement in that grinding voice. but there is nowhere to run in my valley. All roads lead back to me. I kept backing up, eyes on my rearview camera, trying to avoid rocks and cacti. The figure didn't chase me, just stood there watching. But when I was about 100 yards away, I felt my van shudder and stop. Engine still running, but the wheels refusing to turn. I tried shifting gears, tried giving it more gas, but nothing worked. I was stuck, held in place by something I couldn't see or understand. Through my windshield, I watched the figure return to Rory's bus. It reached up and tore the door open, the metal screaming as it came off its hinges. I heard Rory shouting, heard him fighting, and then he was being dragged out, kicking and struggling. The figure held him up like he weighed nothing, examining him the way you'd examine a piece of fruit. "Your fear is sweet," the figure said to Rory. "It flavors the bones, makes them sing better." It carried him toward the pile of bones it had arranged, and I realized with horror what it intended to do. Add Rory to its collection, make him part of its ritual, its sack of bones. I had to do something, had to stop this, but my van wouldn't move, and I was too far away to help. Then I remembered something from my years working in South Texas, dealing with patients from Mexican families. Some of them carried protections against evil. Crucifixes, prayer cards, small bags of salt and herbs. They believed in these things, believed they could ward off evil spirits and demons. I'd always been skeptical, but right now I was willing to try anything. I dug through my belongings frantically, looking for anything that might count as holy or protective. I found a small cross on a chain that my grandmother had given me years ago, something I kept more out of sentiment than belief. I grabbed it, threw open my van door, and ran toward the figure, holding the cross out in front of me like a weapon. The figure turned, still holding Rory, and when it saw the cross, it hissed. Actually hissed like a snake and took a step back. "Faith," it said, and there was contempt in its voice. Weak faith, barely held, almost forgotten, but faith nonetheless. It set Rory down, almost gently, and turned its full attention to me. "You do not believe, Death Carrier. You only hope. Hope is not enough." It was right. I didn't really believe this cross would protect me. I was a man of science, of medicine, of rational explanations. But I'd seen enough in my career to know that the world was stranger and darker than our understanding of it. And right now, this creature was the only evidence I needed that there were things beyond science. "Maybe I don't believe," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But they do." I gestured toward the south, toward Mexico, toward all the families who'd lived in this region for generations, who'd created the legend of El Silban, who'd warned about this valley. Their faith is real. Their belief gives this power. And I'm invoking it now, whether I deserve to or not. The figure laughed, a sound like breaking bones, but it didn't advance. Rory scrambled to his feet and ran toward me, stumbling and falling, but getting up and running again. He reached me and grabbed my arm, gasping for breath. "Don't stop," he whispered. "Whatever you're doing, don't stop." Astrid had gotten out of her Airstream and was running toward us too, clutching something in her hand, a small statue or figurine, I couldn't tell what. The three of us stood together, facing this creature, this demon or ghost or whatever it was, and I felt my van's engine still running behind me, felt the possibility of escape. "You cannot leave," the figure said again, but there was less certainty in its voice now. "This is my valley. I claim what enters my valley." I held the cross higher, channeling every bit of hope and desperation I had. "We're leaving. Right now. And you're going to let us go." The figure's empty eye sockets seemed to bore into me, weighing my resolve, testing my faith or lack thereof. Then it reached down to its pile of bones, picked up a skull, and held it up to its face. "Very well, Death Carrier. You may leave, but you carry a debt now. A life spared is a life owed. Remember this when death comes calling again. Remember that I let you go, and that I can always find you." It turned away, dismissing us, and began gathering its bones back into the sack. The spell or force or whatever had been holding our vehicles broke, and I felt it like a physical release, like pressure dropping. "Get in your vehicles," I said urgently to Astrid and Rory. "Don't look back, don't stop, just drive." We ran to our respective vehicles, started engines that caught immediately, and drove. The route out was treacherous in the darkness. No headlights illuminating all the obstacles we'd carefully navigated on the way in, but none of us cared. We drove recklessly, dangerously, bouncing over rocks and through washes, scraping undercarriages and blowing shocks, focused only on getting away from that valley. It took us 2 hours to reach the main park road, and another hour after that to get to a developed campground where there were other people, lights, the blessed normalcy of civilization. We parked in a tight cluster, and none of us got out of our vehicles until sunrise. We sat in our separate spaces, processing what had happened, tried to convince ourselves it had been real. In the morning light, we examined the damage to our vehicles. Rory's bus door was torn completely off, and there were deep gouges in his hood where that thing had grabbed it. Gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingers, but were far too large for any human hand. Astrid's Airstream had developed electrical problems. The whole system fried like it had been hit by a power surge. My van seemed okay mechanically, but when I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the paint on my back doors, in letters 6 inches tall, were the words, Duda pendiente, debt pending. The figure's promise, or threat, made visible. A reminder that it had let us go, and that it expected payment someday. We left Big Bend that day, all of us heading in different directions. Astrid went back to New Mexico, said she was done with Vanlife and was going to settle down somewhere with lots of people and lights. Rory headed east to Louisiana, back to his parents' place, said he needed to be around family for a while. I drove to Houston, sold my van, and moved into an apartment. Started working as a paramedic again because that's what I know, and because the figure had been right. I do carry death with me, and maybe that's my purpose. I still have that cross my grandmother gave me. I wear it every day now, not hidden under my shirt, but visible, out in the open. I don't know if I believe in its power, but I believe in the power of belief itself, if that makes sense. And I believe that there are things in the world, in the remote places, the forgotten valleys, the borderlands between civilization and wilderness, that operate by rules we don't understand. El Silban, or whatever that thing really was, it exists in that space. It's part of the folklore, the collective belief of generations of people who lived in that harsh desert landscape. And belief has power, gives shape to things that might otherwise be formless, gives rules to things that might otherwise be chaos. The people who created the legend of El Silban, they also created the protections against it, the prayers, the crosses, the rituals that could ward it off. I think about Rory sometimes, wonder if he's okay, if he's managed to move past what happened. I think about Astrid and her Airstream and her attempt to find peace on the road. And I think about that valley, El Valle de Los Perdidos, still out there in the Big Bend wilderness, still claiming those who enter it without proper respect or protection. The Vanlife community online, they still post about Big Bend, about the incredible camping spots and the beautiful landscapes. Sometimes I see people planning trips to remote areas, talking about getting off the grid and finding solitude. I want to warn them, want to tell them that some places are remote for a reason, that some solitude is dangerous. But I know how I would have reacted to such a warning before my experience. With skepticism, with dismissal, with the arrogance of someone who thinks they know better than superstitious locals. So I don't warn them. I just keep my cross, and I remember the debt I owe, and I wait. Because El Silban told me death would come calling again, and in my line of work, death is a constant companion. I see it every shift, the car accidents, the heart attacks, the violence and tragedy that humans inflict on each other. And sometimes, when I'm working a particularly bad scene, when I'm trying to save someone who's too far gone, I hear it. That whistling, faint and distant, like something is watching me work, like something is keeping score. The debt is pending, and someday I'll have to pay it. I just hope when that day comes, I have enough faith, real faith, not just desperate hope, to face what's waiting for me. Because I learned in that valley that the world is bigger and stranger and more terrifying than I ever imagined. And that sometimes the old stories, the legends and warnings passed down through generations, they're not just stories. They're survival information, encoded in myth and metaphor, telling us which places to avoid and which rules to follow. I didn't follow those rules. I entered El Valle de los Perdidos without permission, without protection, without proper respect. And I survived only because something I didn't even believe in, a cross, a symbol, a representation of faith held by others, gave me just enough power to bargain for our lives. That's not a lesson I'll forget, and it's not a debt I can ignore, no matter how much I might want to. My name is Colette Beaumont. I'm 31 years old, and I used to live in Seattle, Washington, where I worked as a marine biologist studying salmon populations. When the grant funding dried up and my position was eliminated, I decided to take it as a sign. I've been feeling burnout anyway, tired of lab work and data analysis and academic politics. So I bought a well-used Dodge Ram with a slide-in camper, packed up my life, and started heading south with a vague plan to spend some time in the desert and figure out what came next. I've been traveling solo for about 4 months when I met Hannah at a rest stop outside of Reno. She was 55, this tough, weathered woman who'd been living full-time in a modified ambulance for 7 years. We got to talking over bad vending machine coffee, and she mentioned she was heading to Pyramid Lake to do some fishing and photography. I'd heard of Pyramid Lake, this massive desert lake about an hour northeast of Reno, sacred to the Paiute tribe, famous for its enormous cutthroat trout. It sounded interesting, so when Hannah invited me to tag along, I said yes. What neither of us knew was that Pyramid Lake has a dark history that goes way beyond fishing and scenic views. The Paiute people have stories about the lake that date back centuries. Stories about water babies, small, malevolent creatures that live in the depths and lure people to their deaths. They say you can hear the water babies crying at night, sounding exactly like human infants in distress. And if you go to investigate, if you get too close to the water, they pull you in and drown you. The Paiute take these stories seriously, have strict rules about when and where you can swim, about what offerings you should make before entering the water. We arrived at Pyramid Lake in the late afternoon, driving along the eastern shore on the tribal lands. The lake was stunning, turquoise water stretching for miles, surrounded by pale desert hills, with these bizarre tufa rock formations jutting out of the water like ancient sculptures. The pyramid-shaped rock that gave the lake its name dominated the southern end, massive and imposing against the sky. Hannah knew about a dispersed camping spot near the northern end of the lake, away from the developed areas, where we'd have the beach basically to ourselves. We found the spot easily enough, a sandy area right on the shore, protected from the wind by some low hills. Hannah parked her ambulance, and I pulled my truck up beside it. The water was maybe 20 yards from where we set up camp, calm and impossibly blue in the fading light. Hannah immediately got out her fishing gear and headed for the shore, talking about how Pyramid Lake cutthroat could grow to 30 pounds or more, how they were remnants of an ancient Lahontan cutthroat population that had adapted to the lake's unique chemistry. I was more interested in the water itself, in the biology and ecology of this desert oasis. I walked along the shore, examining the rocks and sand, noting the complete absence of vegetation right at the waterline. The lake has no outlet, just evaporation, which makes it increasingly saline and alkaline over time. Not many things can survive in water like that, which makes the giant trout even more remarkable. I was so focused on my observations that I didn't notice how quiet it had gotten, how there were no birds calling, no insects buzzing, just this heavy silence broken only by the gentle lapping of water. Hannah caught 2 fish before sunset, decent-sized cutthroat that she cleaned and prepared for dinner. We built a fire in a ring made from lake stones and grilled the fish with some vegetables she had in her cooler. The meal was good, the company was easy, and for a while I felt more relaxed than I had in months. We talked about our lives before the road, about what drove us to leave everything behind and embrace this nomadic lifestyle. Hannah had left after her husband died, said she couldn't stand being in their house alone, surrounded by memories. I'd left because I'd lost my sense of purpose, my connection to the work I'd once loved. As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped fast. Desert nights are always cold, but there was something else too, a dampness in the air that seemed to come off the lake, a chill that got into your bones and wouldn't leave. We moved closer to the fire, and Hannah pulled out a bottle of whiskey that we passed back and forth, sipping straight from the bottle because neither of us had brought proper glasses. That's when we heard the first cry. It sounded exactly like a baby, a newborn, maybe a few weeks old, wailing with that particular distress that infants have when something is seriously wrong. The sound came from the direction of the water, maybe 50 yards down the shore. Hannah and I looked at each other, both of us immediately alert. "What the hell?" Hannah said, standing up and peering into the darkness. The crying continued, desperate and heartbreaking, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to go check, to find that baby and help it. But my rational mind was asking how a baby could possibly be out here, miles from the nearest town, on a cold night by a remote desert lake. It didn't make sense. "Should we check it out?" I asked, already knowing what Hannah's answer would be. "Something's not right," she said, and I heard tension in her voice. "There's no way there's a baby out here. No way." But the crying was so convincing, so real, that it was hard to ignore. We stood there by our fire, listening to it, and I noticed that it was moving. The sound would come from one spot, then stop, then start again from a different location, slightly closer to our camp each time. "Water babies," Hannah said quietly, and when I looked at her in confusion, she explained. "The Paiute warn about them. Creatures that live in the lake, that sound like crying babies to lure people to the water. I thought it was just folklore, just stories to keep kids from swimming in dangerous areas. But," she gestured toward the lake, toward the crying that was now coming from multiple directions, like there were several babies scattered along the shore. I'm a scientist, trained to look for rational explanations, to reject supernatural claims until all natural possibilities are exhausted. But I'd also studied enough biology to know that nature is full of deception, of creatures that mimic other species to lure prey or avoid predators. Maybe these water babies, if they existed, were some kind of unknown species that had evolved to mimic human infant cries. Or maybe Hannah was right, and this was something beyond natural explanation, something that belonged to the folklore and beliefs of the people who'd lived here for thousands of years. The crying got louder, closer, and now I could hear splashing sounds, like something moving through the shallow water near the shore. Hannah grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam across the lake. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just water and rocks and the reflections of our fire. Then the beam caught something moving in the shallows, maybe 30 yards away. It looked small, about the size of a human infant, with pale, glistening skin. It was crawling through the water toward the shore, moving with an awkward, jerking motion. As Hannah held the light on it, it stopped and turned toward us. The face was wrong, too wide, too flat, with eyes that were too large and too dark, and a mouth that opened to reveal rows of tiny needle-like teeth. It let out another cry, that perfect imitation of a distressed baby, and I felt my skin crawl. "There's more of them," Hannah said, moving her flashlight along the shore. She was right. I could see at least 5 or 6 of the creatures, all crawling out of the water, all moving toward our camp with clear intent. They were hunting us, using the baby cries to draw us closer, and when that didn't work, they were coming to us instead. "Get in the vehicles," I said, falling back on the same logic that had saved me in past encounters with dangerous wildlife. "Put barriers between yourself and the threat." Hannah didn't argue. We abandoned our fire and ran for our vehicles, her to the ambulance and me to my truck camper. I locked the doors and watched through my windows as the creatures continued to emerge from the lake. There were dozens of them now, maybe more, crawling up the beach with that same jerking, unnatural motion. In the firelight, I could see them more clearly. Humanoid, but definitely not human, with webbed hands and feet, skin that looked more like fish scales than mammalian tissue, and those awful faces that were almost baby-like but distorted, monstrous. The crying had stopped, replaced by a different sound, a clicking, chirping noise like communication between the creatures. They surrounded our vehicles, circling them, reaching up to touch the metal and glass. I heard scratching on my door, felt the truck rock slightly as they pushed against it. Through my window, I watched one of them stand upright, balancing on its webbed feet, and it was maybe 3 feet tall, proportioned like a toddler, but with that fish-like skin and those predatory teeth. It looked directly at me, and I saw intelligence in those 2 large eyes, awareness and hunger, and something that might have been curiosity. My phone had no signal out here, which I'd expected. Hannah and I couldn't communicate except by hand signals through our windows. She held up her phone, pointed at it, shook her head. No signal for her either. We were on our own, surrounded by these creatures, with no way to call for help and no clear escape route. The things were packed so densely around our vehicles that trying to drive out would mean running over dozens of them, and I had no idea how they'd react to that. The scratching intensified, and I heard something that sounded like metal being tested, stressed. These creatures were strong, stronger than their small size suggested, and they were working together, coordinating their efforts. Some of them were trying to pry open my camper door, while others were examining the windows, looking for weak points. I realized with growing horror that they were problem-solving, using intelligence to find a way inside. Then I heard breaking glass, not from my truck, but from Hannah's ambulance. One of the creatures had found a small vent window and had managed to break it. I saw Hannah moving inside, heard her shouting, though I couldn't make out the words. The creatures responded to her shouts with excited clicking and chirping, and more of them started climbing up the sides of her ambulance, heading for that broken window. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit in my truck and watch Hannah get attacked. I looked around my camper for anything I could use as a weapon or deterrent. I had a marine flare gun, something I kept from my research days for signaling boats. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I loaded it, cracked open my door just wide enough to aim, and fired the flare straight up into the night sky. The flare burst into brilliant red light, illuminating the entire beach and the lake beyond. The creatures reacted immediately, shrieking and scattering, clearly startled or frightened by the sudden brightness. In that moment of chaos, I threw open my door, jumped out, and ran to Hannah's ambulance. The creatures were regrouping, recovering from their initial panic, but I had maybe seconds before they came at me. Hannah had her door locked, but she opened it when she saw me. "Get in," she yelled, and I dove inside, slamming the door behind me just as the creatures reached us. They swarmed the ambulance, covering every surface, their clicking and chirping rising to a deafening level. Hannah's ambulance had metal mesh over most of the windows, a modification she'd made for security when camping in sketchy areas. And now that mesh was the only thing between us and dozens of those needle-toothed mouths. "We need more light," I said, thinking about how they'd reacted to the flare. "Bright light seems to scare them." Hannah nodded and started going through her storage compartments. She found a spotlight, the kind used for night fishing, with a powerful LED bulb. She plugged it into her vehicle's power system and turned it on, aiming it out the windshield. The effect was immediate. The creatures directly in front of the spotlight shrieked and dropped off the ambulance, retreating toward the water. But the ones on the sides and back weren't affected, and they continued their assault, scratching and prying and testing every surface. Hannah rotated the spotlight, sweeping it across the swarm, and each time the beam hit them, they fled. But there were too many, and we couldn't keep the light on all of them at once. "We need to get out of here," Hannah said, stating the obvious. "If we can clear a path to the road, we can drive out." I nodded, already forming a plan. "I'll use the spotlight to clear the front. You drive. When we get close to my truck, stop and I'll jump out and get in. Then we both drive out together." It wasn't a great plan, but it was all we had. Hannah started her engine, and the creatures responded with renewed frenzy, sensing we were about to escape. I aimed the spotlight forward, sweeping it back and forth, creating a corridor of light that the creatures avoided. Hannah put the ambulance in gear and started moving forward slowly. The creatures on the sides and roof were thrown off as we accelerated, tumbling to the ground with wet, slapping sounds. We drove toward my truck, and I kept the lights sweeping, keeping our path clear. The creatures were following us, running alongside the ambulance, trying to climb back on, but Hannah was going fast enough now that they couldn't keep up. She stopped beside my truck, and I grabbed my keys, threw open the ambulance door, and sprinted the few feet to my camper. I heard clicking right behind me, felt something grab at my ankle. I kicked hard and felt my boot connect with something solid, but yielding. The grip released, and I threw myself into my truck, slamming the door. I started my engine, threw it in gear, and followed Hannah as she accelerated toward the dirt road that led back to the highway. In my rearview mirror, I could see the creatures massing on the beach, dozens of them, maybe over 100, their pale bodies reflecting the moonlight. We drove fast on that rough road, not caring about the damage we might be doing to our suspensions or undercarriages. We just needed to get away from the lake, away from those things. It wasn't until we hit pavement and had driven another 10 miles that we finally felt safe enough to stop and check on each other. Hannah pulled over at a closed rest area, and I parked beside her. We got out of our vehicles and just stood there for a moment, both of us shaking, processing what had just happened. What the hell were those things? I asked, and even as I said it, I knew the answer. They were exactly what the Paiute had warned about for centuries. Water babies, creatures that lived in Pyramid Lake, that lured people to their deaths with crying sounds, that hunted in packs when opportunity presented itself. I don't know, Hannah said, but I could tell she knew too. She was just having trouble accepting it, the same way I was having trouble reconciling what I'd seen with my scientific training. Some kind of aquatic predator, something that's adapted to mimic human sounds. She was trying to fit it into a rational framework, trying to make it make sense. We examined our vehicles in the harsh fluorescent lights of the rest area. Hannah's ambulance had scratches everywhere, deep gouges in the paint and metal where the creatures had been trying to get in. The vent window was shattered, and there were dents in the roof from where they'd been climbing. My truck camper had similar damage, scratches on the doors, dents in the panels, and when I looked at my ankle, I could see marks through my jeans where something had grabbed me, almost like suction cup marks mixed with small puncture wounds. We decided not to go back for our camping gear, the fire ring, the fishing equipment we'd left behind. It wasn't worth the risk. We drove to Reno that night, got a motel room with 2 beds, and sat up drinking coffee and trying to make sense of our experience. Hannah pulled up information on her phone about Pyramid Lake, about the water baby legends, and we read accounts from Paiute elders warning about the creatures, describing them in ways that matched exactly what we'd seen. There were also reports, modern reports from the last few decades, of people drowning in Pyramid Lake under mysterious circumstances. Experienced swimmers who'd simply disappeared beneath the surface and never came up. Fishermen who'd fallen out of boats in calm water and drowned despite wearing life jackets. Children who'd waded into the shallows and been pulled under before their parents could react. The official explanations usually involved undertows or sudden drop-offs or cold water shock, but reading them now, knowing what we knew, it seemed obvious that something else was responsible. We should report this, I said, though I wasn't sure to whom. Someone needs to know that those things are out there, that they're dangerous. Hannah shook her head. Report it to who? And say what? That we were attacked by cryptids? They'd think we were crazy or high or making it up for attention. No, Colette. This is one of those things that we just have to live with. The Paiute know about them, warn about them. People who listen to the warnings are safe. People who don't. She trailed off, but the implication was clear. We parted ways the next morning. Hannah was heading to Oregon, said she needed trees and rain and green things after the desert had tried to kill her. I headed south to California, back toward the coast, back toward the ocean that I understood and felt safe around. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch, but we both knew we probably wouldn't. Some experiences bond people together, but others are too traumatic to revisit, and staying in contact would mean constantly being reminded of what we'd survived. I never went back to Pyramid Lake. I've driven past the turnoff a few times since then, and each time I felt this pull, this urge to go back and see if it really happened, if those creatures are really there. But I resisted. I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I don't need to confirm it again. The scientific part of my brain wants to study them, to understand their biology and ecology and evolutionary history. But the survival part of my brain, the part that kept me alive that night, knows that some things are better left alone. I've been back in marine biology for about 6 months now, working on a kelp forest restoration project off the coast of Monterey. It's good work, meaningful work, and being around the ocean again has helped me feel grounded and purposeful. But I can't look at the water the same way anymore. I know now that there are things living in lakes and oceans and rivers that we don't understand, things that have adapted to their environments in ways that seem impossible, that blur the line between natural and supernatural. The Vanlife community still talks about Pyramid Lake as this amazing destination, this beautiful desert oasis perfect for camping and fishing and photography. I see people posting pictures from the exact beach where Hannah and I were attacked, smiling and relaxed, completely unaware of what lives in that water. Part of me wants to warn them, to tell them about the water babies and the danger. But I know how I would have reacted to such a warning before my experience, with skepticism and dismissal, thinking the person was trying to scare me or was just repeating local folklore without understanding it. So I don't warn them. I just scroll past their posts and hope they're lucky, hope they camp during the day and leave before dark, hope they don't hear the crying sounds that might lure them too close to the water. And I keep my own memories private, locked away, except for the occasional nightmare where I'm back on that beach, surrounded by those pale, crawling things with their too large eyes and needle teeth. Hannah sent me one message about 3 weeks after we parted ways. Just one line. I still hear them crying sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. I understood exactly what she meant. I hear them too, in that space between waking and sleeping, that baby cry that sounds so real and so desperate. And I have to remind myself that it's not real, that I'm not at Pyramid Lake anymore, that there's nothing outside my door try to lure me to my death. The Paiute were right. The water babies are real. They've been real for thousands of years, living in Pyramid Lake, hunting anything that comes too close to the water after dark. They're part of that ecosystem, adapted to it in ways we can barely comprehend. And they're protected by the very fact that most people don't believe they exist, that we've labeled them as folklore and mythology instead of accepting them as part of the natural world. I don't know if I'll ever go back to van life full-time. Right now, I'm content with weekend trips, staying in developed campgrounds with lots of other people around, avoiding remote areas where I might encounter things that shouldn't exist but do. I've learned that there's a difference between solitude and isolation, between getting away from it all and putting yourself in danger by going too far from safety. The world is stranger and more dangerous than we like to believe. And sometimes the old stories, the legends and warnings passed down through generations, they're not just entertainment or cultural tradition. They're survival information, telling us what to avoid and how to stay safe in a world that's full of things we don't understand and maybe never will.